Hey everyone. So I wanted to chat about community development principles. You guys did great work on your presentations, but the one thing I noticed was that some of the connection between the projects and the community development principles wasn't as strong as it could be. And that was something that also came up in the feedback that other students were giving about the projects too. So I wanted to just go over those community development principles because we talked about a lot of them, and I think it can be a bit tricky to parse out what is a community development principle and what isn't, and how to talk about it. And you'll want to be using this language in your papers, and you'll also want to be using it next week when we do the test. So, community development. The first principle that we talked about a lot in class was this idea that community development uses systems theory, uses interconnection. And in community development, everything is related. So we look for the connections between things. We don't just work on one issue. We understand that there's root causes and that's connected to other things. We look at working from not only the micro level, but the meso and the macro. And when we think about social work, the ecological model is that use of systems theory when we understand people in a wider perspective. The second community development principle that is important is the use of anti-oppressive practice, understanding injustice and removing barriers. So when we look at anti-oppressive practice with community development, we talked about understanding structural barriers, we talked about practicing cultural competency and humility, and we talked about a number of different examples of anti-oppressive community work, that community development work is political, that we acknowledge intersectional oppressions, that we have a multi-layered and holistic model of practice, and so on. And so using anti-oppressive practice, understanding that is important. And so if you think about the Hi-Bye project, that uses that anti-oppressive practice, understanding that Black youth in Regent Park are facing different injustices than other youth are. They're facing different structural barriers, and the project is aimed to really address that. The third big community development principle that we talked about is the strength-based approach. And we looked at things like asset-based community development, the community capital framework, and we also looked at this idea of the needs assessment and consultation to determine direction. Asset-based community development makes visible and values the skills, knowledge, connections, and potentials in a community. So we're really talking about how do we value what people bring, how do we promote their own capacity and the social capital. And a lot of your projects used a strength-based approach. So for example, in the project that was working with immigrant women, there was an acknowledgement that women were bringing all this knowledge and skills from their past, and they were looking for ways that they could bring women together to share that and grow from that. And folks who were using gyms or community centers for free in their communities, that's also an example of asset-based community development. What does your community already have that you can use? What are those community capital assets in the community? Third community development principle is development and empowerment. And this one is key in every community development project. So development and empowerment is about equalizing power relationships, building new skills, mutual ownership of possibilities. And so when I was asking, well, how do we know that people are empowered? What are the things that you're doing to empower people? I want to hear about how people are acquiring new skills, how people are being linked with other people with shared interests, how we promote capability and initiative. And so anytime we're using volunteers in our program, we're really thinking about an empowerment model, right? So we're relying on the people within our communities and giving them the opportunities to share their skills. And anytime we are helping other people build new skills, it's an example of a development and empowerment versus a project that would, just give food to kids. We're teaching kids how to cook. The last community development principle that's important to really know and understand is this idea of deepening participation. We want in community development to bring people in, not just as passive observers, but as active participants. And we do that using outreach. We provide different opportunities to move people up the ladder of participation. So from informing them, so for example, a workshop about what happens in gangs, that's an example of informing, but empowering and involving is involving people in a neighborhood watch, empowering them to be the tutors to small kids. Those are all ways that we're bringing people in to help them be more active participants. And that's it. So just make sure as you're writing, as you're thinking about your project, that you're using some of this language and making the connections between those principles and the things you're already doing, because your projects are already community development projects, but they require that connection to theory to make it stronger, make your case stronger for the project. Looking forward to seeing all of you Wednesday.